Welcome to our webinar today. This is focused on security and compliance for the remote workforce. And so we're going to be talking about what you can do to manage the extra risks that come from having your entire workforce working from home and how you can improve your data security at the same time. So we'll have some time at the end for you to ask your questions. You can drop those into the chat or the Q&A at any time during the presentations here. We'll get around to those in just a bit. And feel free to ask us questions about what we're saying, as well as some things that are on the periphery, like does being remote put your workforce out of compliance with your industry requirements? What does it mean for specific standards that you might use, like HIPAA or high trust? And questions about kind of training, best practices, some other things. So here with me today, I've got Darren Gallop, the CEO of Securicy. And Darren, can you introduce yourself?
Hey there, everybody. Great to see you all. Thanks for coming in. I'm the CEO of Securicy, and we specialize in helping businesses build, implement, and manage information security and disaster planning for small to medium-sized businesses. Predominantly, I'm a certified information system professional with a long track record and history as an entrepreneur. So I know the security side and very, very well as the business side. And also today we have a guest with us today, Mr. Craig Sandman, who is the president of Symbol Security. And he's actually going to start off introducing himself. And he has a couple of things he's going to share with us that will be very applicable to this topic.
Great. Thank you, Darren, and thanks, Shannon. Yeah, Craig Sandman, so I'm president of a company called Symbol Security. We are a security awareness training platform. So we focus on user education. As I mentioned to Darren and Shannon as we were warming up here, Symbol Security does not actually prevent any malicious activity or malicious emails from the outside in with technology. We train user populations to help build up what we call your human firewall and help your company mitigate risk in that way. So I think Darren and Shannon, it's an incredible timing to be talking about this stuff because of the amount of cyber activity that's happening out there. And I'd be happy to start and just kind of share a couple examples that we're seeing in the market if you'd like.
Let's take a look.
Great.
Yeah. So so as I was saying, before we got started here, cyber criminals, they market and they target on an event basis. So, you see this in the trade rags, and we talk about it certainly from a training focus perspective, that as seasons change and as events change, so change the targeting of cyber criminals to companies and to users, right? So when it's holiday shopping season, we see a lot of malicious emails targeted around sales and discounts and gift cards. When the calendar turns to January and February and we start getting into tax season, we see a lot of tax fraud and tax filings with realtors and real estate closings. We see a lot of activity around fraudulent wire requests. So as a home closing is coming together and you have 6 or 8 different parties, 4 on one side, 4 on the other, all communicating to each other about a large financial closing that's about to happen. It only takes one corrupted email, with potentially a cyber criminal watching the dialogue going back and forth to insert, a fraudulent wire information at the last minute, like something along the lines of, hey, unfortunately, we've had a change in the last minute. We now need the closing proceeds to be wired to this account, not that account. And it needs to be done in 2 hours or else we won't be able to close tomorrow, right? That kind of a thing. All year long, all day long, cyber criminals are, seeking out the events that drive the urgency. And we're in the middle of 2 incredible events right now from just a surge in cyber criminal activity. The first is COVID-19 and the coronavirus. And the second related is the work from home surge that's happened as well, where we have millions and millions of users now working from home, leveraging tools and systems in a different way than many of them were used to. Many of us are very used to working from home and what that entails. Others are not. And so it creates a sea of confusion, which opens up the doors for cyber criminals. And a lot of cyber criminal activity comes in the form of phishing emails. So we've all heard of phishing. What I'm going to do is I will actually, I want to show a couple of examples of how phishing often occurs. And we'll just get a look at some samples. So I'm going to share my screen here. And I've seen a lot. Can you guys see? Are you looking at my desktop or are you looking at the
Yeah, I
email?
see a HubSpot password.
Yes, okay.
HubSpot
All
deactivated.
right. So what we're looking at here is a couple of emails from HubSpot. What's interesting about assessing the dangers of phishing emails and potentially determining if there's anything that needs to be, anything that's concerning. What I hear a lot is, be careful, right? Or, carefully interrogate your email. Make sure there's nothing suspicious about it. And those are good suggestions, but unfortunately for most people, it's very difficult for them to understand, well, what does that mean? And so frequently in webinars and in training sessions, we'll put up a couple emails right next to each other and we'll ask people, which one's fake and which one's real. And we get a lot of different answers. In fact, I was on a webinar the other day and I had, a group tell me that the email on the right was fake. And I had a group tell me that the email on the left was fake. And one of them's real and one of them is fake. So we see things like, hey, the logo on the left, it looks a little bit funny. And, the message on the right, the ID here seems like it's a little too much information. The reality is, there are some safe places that users can interrogate emails, and there are, some dead giveaways. So I'll just walk through these real quickly. In this case, if we click on the sender name, we can validate a sender name of HubSpot.com, and that's a pretty good sign. It's not a foolproof sign, but it's a pretty good sign. In this one, we have a sender name of no reply at HubSpot.recordsconfirmations.com, and this is oftentimes where people get in trouble, and where cyber criminals are very smooth. It's a strategy of putting a generic domain name, and a trusted name in the subdomain. Now, those of us that are a little more technical in nature, we know that a subdomain, has absolutely no meaning towards the domain. But many users will look at this and say, oh, well, I can see HubSpot's there, so it must be their records confirmations department. And this trick goes on and on and on. So this is one place where we try to train users to look. It's a very common tactic. And the other tactic within the emails is simply hovering over a URL or an action button. I call this an action button here. This email on the left is legitimate. It still has a little bit of a suspicious URL though, because HubSpot's using a different URL than their corporate URL to track the clicks and activity. So the URL they've advertised is api.hubapi.com, which, unless I'm very familiar with HubSpot's messaging, I'm probably not going to click here. I'd go to my HubSpot account and I'd log in, and I would see if I had notifications that indicated that my password's been updated or anything along those lines. If I come to the email on the right, I get a very long URL when I hover. Now, this is just a marketing service, SendGrid. So theoretically, it's not guaranteed malicious, but it's also not taking me to HubSpot. So Darren and Chan, and I wanted to share a couple examples there. So, we could talk through some of the ways that that emails can get manipulated as we continue to receive emails and wonder, hey, is this legitimate, or is this not? And two quick methods there: checking the sender name, validating domain versus subdomain, and then hovering over a URL. Generally, those are very effective at eliminating not every single issue that you would see, but many of them.
Yeah, and one thing I just wanted to add into, like when you talk about the subdomain for those who aren't very technical, like basically when you see like the at HubSpot dot something else, the domain is literally only the words that are directly before the .com or .co or .ca. So like where I own securicy.com, I could very easily go right now and create a subdomain called HubSpot, and that would be then the URL hubspot.securicy.com. So like it's just really critical to understand that. And I think that's a really good example there. And like what I found funny, like I'm playing the same game as the listeners while you're showing those and trying to guess which one is the good one and the bad one. And I hate when I see like Hub API, because again, like the thing is like, wait a minute, that's not HubSpot. So it kind of gets the flag going.
Right.
And a lot of the times, like what I'll do is if I don't recognize the URL, I'll actually just extract the URL piece and I'll Google the URL. And if it's something that's commonly used, either maliciously or positively, you'll generally be able to get a pretty good indication from a quick Google search. It's the same as phone numbers sometimes, like when you're getting these random phone calls, right? The phishing phone calls, and you Google a phone number and then all of a sudden you see like, do not answer.
Right. Right. No, absolutely. It is, the more, just a little bit of investigation can go a really long way. And you're right, those are two very common tricks. I also wanted to share something that we're seeing a lot of with respect to coronavirus and some of the targets of coronavirus. So CDC, World Health Organization, have probably never been more popular in terms of the amount of airtime they're getting, right? So if you think of coronavirus, CDC, and World Health Organization, again, all three of those terms are very widely used. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but the number of domain names now surrounding coronavirus, or
it was 80 3 weeks ago. That was the stat 3 weeks ago. There was 80 URLs. So I'm imagining that that's inflated since.
Yeah, something 14, 16,000 or something along those lines. So now you have to wonder, okay, which one of those domains is legitimate, which one isn't? But I wanted to share with you guys here, hang on one second. I want to share with you guys some examples of what we're seeing in terms of CDC and World Health Organization manipulation. So I'm going to just share screen. So again, same trick. This one on the left here, credit to Kaspersky for this particular one here, but here we go again. So the CDC's actual email address or URL is down here. It's cdc.gov. That's the legitimate CDC URL. Up here in the sender name, they've manipulated it. Very crafty too, right? cdc-gov.org. When you see, .gov.org, and you see the words gov and org, those trigger pretty safe feelings for people. However, this is manipulated to be cdc-gov, right? So cdc-gov becomes the domain name, .org becomes the extension, .org's not overly regulated. So you have an opportunity to have a lot of manipulation in this, leveraging the CDC initials and then something else, .org. So that's one that was picked up earlier in the month. And then down here, you have what looks an email address, that looks to be fairly legit, although this is screenshot, so we haven't, been able to click on the sender here and actually see what's underneath that. But down here in the URL, we've got a link that this is a little bit small, so you may not be able to see it, but it's not taking you, when you hover over this link, it's not taking you to cdc.gov. It's taking you to healing-yui223.com, which is obviously not where you're intending to go. So those are a couple examples of emails that we've seen. And there's many, many more. If you Google CDC or World Health Organization phishing emails, you'll see a ton of them, one after another, after another, after another. And it's just, it's the same thing we mentioned. It's cyber criminals manipulating a situation. But again, the principles we talked about hold true. Validating sender name and hovering on URL and validating the URL destination. Both those tactics, even though these emails may have slipped through email security systems, if you are able to conduct those manual tests as a user, you'll be okay.
We saw one a couple of weeks ago, actually, that was using foreign languages and that have symbols that are different than the common, alphabet that we use in English and Latin languages. I think it was a Russian character that looked like an A but wasn't, and so they were able to create a replicated URL where they implemented this character that looks like an A. Pardon, I don't know what it is. I don't speak Russian, but they were able to actually implement a character that was an A, but that in a quick look looked like an A. So
Right.
like really be like very keenly scrutinizing these things, especially when there's all those other signs like sense of urgency, and you're talking about divulging information and things like that, right? To certainly like be cautious. I think like COVID-19, people being stressed out, not sleeping well, working really hard, trying to get adapted, that whole chaos and commotion really creates an environment where careful maybe not be the thing you're being all the time in email. Right. So taking that, slowing down just a little bit, especially when something is asking you questions or looking for things that are not straight up usual or that seem to have a sense of urgency apply to them.
Yeah, I've also seen phishing. We've also seen some phishing examples come through where it looks like it's coming from your boss or right. someone in the company. Yeah, even I got one that looked like it was coming from Darren from a personal address, and it was 100% a phishing email asking for me to provide personal information. You can also get them, be skeptical if you ever get an email, especially that's unexpected from someone in your company saying, hey, download this right now. Even it might be trying to be legitimate by saying, download this antivirus software that we're implementing. And it's not an antivirus software, it's an actual virus that it's sending you to in the end. And so they can get very tricky.
Craig, I think it's similar to like when you and I talked last week about doing this panel, and we were talking about how like the hackers are also trapped in their homes. So that's like all of a sudden the hackers have more time, and like some of them are new to hacking because they used to have a real job, which they don't have, but now they created a new job and it's right. hacking. So it's not only the question of like the chaos and the opportunity there, but it's also like there's more players putting in more time, at their hacking stations right now as well.
Yeah. One of the things I think about too, when so your company's helping to develop and maintain security policies for companies, right? Some of those security policies have, verification or validation components to them, and they may extend beyond, the actual security policies into more process. But a lot of the verification or validation piece, extends beyond just analyzing the characters of an email. And to what Shannon was saying, let's say that situation, Darren and Shannon, between you was not just asking you for information, Shannon, but it was like a request. It was a wire transfer. It was, something of maybe more potentially damaging scenarios. Those are opportunities to go back to the foundation of the company, which is, you know, your policies and your processes as well too. So part of I think part of the training in a time like this is understanding what to look for at a technical level, a couple technical tips. And the other is, listen, even though we're sitting in our living rooms and our dining rooms, you know, the same verification still applies, right? So if I'm requested to do something, you know, I may be sitting in comfortable clothes and a comfortable couch, I still have to be really on my toes and follow process. So, you know, if I see something like a request for something that I know requires a phone call with, you know, a certain approver in the business, I still have to adhere to that.
Yeah, like we build that into policy and procedure for ourselves and for our customers as well. Things like that. Like if there's please wire 10 grand to this thing, this account, this number. We always have that process where there's a text comes in as a second validating piece. So
Yeah.
different device, different protocol. And it's like, hey, just want to confirm that you want me to wire X to Y.
Yeah.
And then, you know, hopefully they say, yes, absolutely proceed. Or it's like, what the hell are you talking about? Then, you know,
Yeah.
you're being phished.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
A lot of verification too can help on avoiding malware as well too. So Shannon, to your point, some of those urgent messages, you know, hey, we've discovered a vulnerability. Please download this as soon as possible so you can be protected. You know, if it seems a little like that, to me, that would trigger a, okay, maybe I'll just call IT. Hey, I'm getting this email. You know, am I really supposed to do this? And you know, I think a lot of the verification realities put an extra strain on help desk and IT in that way. You get a lot more phone calls, a lot more questions. What we've seen is in organizations, maybe they get one or two phone calls from people that are, you know, being good stewards, and they say, hey, I just want to make sure, am I supposed to be doing this? I'm supposed to be clicking on this email and downloading this patch. Yes, you are. And then hopefully 2 minutes later, an email goes out to the entire corporation. All right, we've received 10 phone calls. We just want to clear things up. This does need to be downloaded. It is coming from the company, right? And that's good. That's a healthy exchange. It's a healthy, you know, kind of circle of communication there. You know, first email went out. Maybe it didn't go out with enough explanation. You know, a couple of users flagged it, verified it, and now, you know, IT and help desk communicating out in a different way, saying, look, I understand we've caused some confusion. Let me clarify. Thank you to the, you know, to the 10 individuals that, you know, called to confirm this. This is legitimate. But these situations now where you're not in an office and you can't walk down 2 cubes and say, hey, I just got this from you. Is this what you want me to do? Now you're a phone call away, which is a little harder to do sometimes, but you still have to make the verification. And so I think the verification becomes kind of the next level of, okay, so, you know, I checked out the sender name, I checked the URLs, kind of looks legitimate, but I've never had to download a patch before. It's always just been pushed to me or whatever the case might be. So yeah, verification and across all forms, simple phone call, right? That's all it typically takes to ensure that, you know, that you're doing something that you're supposed to be doing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so in just a second, I want to open up for questions from the audience. So if you can start dropping your questions into the chat or the Q&A box there, I'll be collecting those and reading those off in just a moment. So you can start dropping those in right now.
Yeah, and while you're doing that, Shannon, there's a couple of things too that I thought would be, you know, one of the things that we do is with companies that have that are implementing work from home, which is now almost everybody. One of the things that we do is have like a network configuration baseline that we recommend having in your work from home policy, and it's really just some high level key things that can substantially improve the security hygiene of the network. And the first one is updating the firmware on the router. And this is something like, if you're not technical, that might sound like a big thing, but really it's very simple to do that. And chances are, if you haven't done it, or if you don't know how to do it, and particularly if you've owned the router for quite some time, then there's a high probability that that router is not up to date. And that because it's not up to date, there's probably substantial vulnerabilities that can easily be executed by a hacker. So learning how to do that, like if you just literally go to your router and look at the model and model number there, and go on Google and like literally how do I update the firmware on net, this Linksys, whatever, you're usually going to find a video or some sort of content there that can walk you through it. It's all like, it's just logging into an interface, and you don't have to like type codes or know how to write like command line or anything like that. It's pretty straightforward. And then like, while you're in your router, go through and have a little look around, like, do you have WPA2 personal encryption versus WEP? And all that should be pretty standard as well. That would be in your Wi-Fi settings, or your radio settings, and then your password hygiene. Like if you've had the same password for a really long time and you give it to everybody who comes to your house, this would be a great opportunity to change that password now that you're doing more critical stuff and you're working from home. And don't let the password be your dog. So like have a real password that's 12 to 14, 16 even characters. I think mine at home is 16. And it's not the dog's name. It's fairly complex. We don't have to memorize it because we put it in the keychains in our devices, so our devices know it. And then we just have the guest network, which has a more laid back, when we're allowed to have guests back at our home. The other thing too is like with your devices, keep the OS and the applications up to date. So, all the computers, iPads, iPhones, having them up to date. A lot of those updates are designed to patch critical and known security flaws. So, the quicker you keep that up to date, the better it's going to be. And then, having an antivirus and endpoint protection of some sort is a really great tool as well. If your company doesn't have one, or if that's not something that the company invests in, even using a free one is better than nothing. Although the paid ones now have gotten really sophisticated, and they can even manage things like configurations, like notifying senior management or the security team if, for example, a device isn't patched or if it's not configured using proper configurations. And then, the other one there, if you really have for companies that, I've talked to a lot of companies in the last couple of days that have like HIPAA compliance or SOC 2 compliance, or even PCI DSS compliance. And in those cases, they have very strict requirements that they have to make sure that they're able to still follow while their force is remote. In most of those cases, we're recommending people use a VPN. So that would be, you still secure your home network, but then on your work computer, when you're working, you have the VPN there, which just creates another layer of security. And like I use PIA, personal, private internet access. But there's several out there, just look them up and check the reputation. But those are that's not all the stuff you can do. You can totally nerd out your home network and put advanced firewalls and all that stuff. But as a minimal sort of viable best practice, and like what I always say when I present an idea to people, like, hey, we want you to do this to your network. I always try to present that also in the context of, this is not just for the company or for me. This is for you and your family too. Like these practices of keeping your network up to date and securing the network is reducing the potential that somebody could hack you personally, hack a family member, hack cameras on your network, or access a child's computer or iPad or whatnot. So it really is, by helping yourself and securing your own home, you're not only helping your work environment be more secure, but you're also actually securing your family as well.
Yeah.
Darren,
So
I was going to ask a question too, Darren, because it's come up a couple of times. So a lot of people are working from home. A lot of these people have children. A lot of these children are at school from home now, right? So there's sometimes you're competing for devices. So can you talk a little bit about security policies and how corporate devices and personal devices, how you can stay out of trouble with regard to that? And the scenarios I'm thinking of is, my kid needs to get on to do their assignment, and, I'm on a video conference on this. Well, here's my work laptop, just log in there. right?
Yeah.
So maybe you could talk about that too, because I think that's a situation that a lot of people are going to encounter that they never have had to deal with before.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And so this now comes down to so the first thing I'll say is the quality of your router. So there's a very big difference between a $25 piece of crap router that you bought 8 years ago or 5 years ago from Best Buy to say a $300 router, for example, which is what I have, a more modern router. And you know, so even just on, it's amazing how many devices you can have in a home. So if you have like a family of 5 and you have some IoT devices, you got your TV on there, you've got some Apple TVs, you got your security cameras, and each kid in the house has each person in the house has a phone. There's a couple of tablets, there's a bunch of computers. Like it gets pretty big. You got gaming systems. Like I've been in people's homes and like, what, there's like, do a network search and there's like 52 devices on a home network. It's like, I've been in small businesses that have less devices on their network than this home, right? So when you get into that scenario, right, obviously like looking at your bandwidth, it may be time. So on like, if you think about the sort of chain of command, all the different things, you have a pipe, that's your internet speed, right, which is your up speed and your down speed. So, you know, looking at that, if you have a poor internet connection and your provider provides an increase in up speed and down speed, that might be a good time to make that investment. And a lot of companies I'm seeing are giving discounts based on the COVID-19 in terms of upgrading that bandwidth. So that's kind of like your pipe coming into the wall into your house. Then the router itself, if you have a lot of devices, buy a good router, especially if this is important stuff. Like the DHCP, I don't want to get too technical because I know that the audience ranges, but the ability for a cheap, crappy router in general to manage a lot of device circulation is usually poor. And when you upgrade your you know, the quality, you get an improvement. I've seen many cases where without even changing the bandwidth at the pipe coming in from your provider, of just improving a better router being an improvement. And then when you get into the routers that have more functionality, you have the ability to then designate IP addresses or MAC addresses. So instead of all devices just going like onto the network and then the DHCP allowing them an address, you could say, hey, this is my work computer, and it's more important than the video games the kids are playing in the basement, or it's even more important than if there's a lag in the assignment upload that my child is doing, right? So then you could then dedicate thresholds and service requirements in the router. And every router is different. There's different namings around this, but if you go through your router, if you Google how to do that, you can dedicate some bandwidth and controls around that. So you can prioritize, and depending on the router, like some will do it by service. So you can prioritize Zoom, for example. So if you have multiple devices, like in my case, sometimes I use my phone for calls. Sometimes I use my computer downstairs. Sometimes I use my computer upstairs. So I can dedicate Zoom as a priority over another service. So there's a little bit of learning curve there. I think it's a great, you know, as you bring it up, I think it's a great, actually, like would be a really great topic for a webinar to go into a router and basically do all these configurations that I talked to, including quality of service. That's QoS is one of the terms that you'll see it in a router, where you're basically, you're prioritizing devices and or services and creating a hierarchy. So, you know, because it can happen, like maybe you've got 3 kids downloading like videos and now you can't have a call. And like, obviously like kid, like, you know, and you can tell them not to, but they may not listen to that. so determining that in your device, like we did it in our home network, we did it for our TV, because we're like, hey, we weren't really working at home at first. So originally, before we were kind of forced to work from home, we had it set up so nothing anyone does on their computer will interrupt the quality of the 4K Ultra HD 5.1 show I'm streaming. But now we've changed our priorities, so we flipped that around, and Zoom is now kind of above that. And
Yeah,
That's
great. And a lot of these are topics that I think a lot of teams can really do as internal webinars, team trainings, virtual lunch and learns, to really dig into these topics, answer questions from their users, and really make sure that everyone on their team understands, is my home network secure? Is my family safe? What can we do to make sure that everyone who's using our router is set up for safety? So I've got a couple questions here, actually, for something that you mentioned there, Darren, about VPNs. So I've got 2 questions that are kind of related. So one is, I'm curious about the necessity of a VPN for our at-home workers. If so, do you have recommendations for an easy to implement VPN, less than 50 employees, that won't bog down their daily work? And the second question, which is an excellent follow-up, is how safe are free VPNs like Proton?
These are great. These are great questions. I think there's two very, like, when people talk about VPNs, the first thing I try to understand is what they're trying to achieve. So originally, a VPN was basically something that was applied in the local area network in your office, and it was a method that people would use to be able to access office resources. Back in the olden days, when everything was not in the clouds, but were actually in your office in a server. So it would be a way of creating an encrypted, credentialized connection to the office environment, which would give you access to all or some of the local area network services in the office. So when you're thinking about a VPN from that context, if you have assets that you're trying to access within the office environment, that's a very different set of vendors. And often in times in an advanced router, you'll get that in the router itself. So it'll have VPN technologies with the ability to use a variety of different encryption protocols in there. When you're talking about a workforce that's generally cloud focused, so like for us at Securicy, our office is well, it's a room basically. It's a bunch of rooms with a network connection that's Wi-Fi and desks and lights and plants. Like, there's literally no technology. So when everybody goes home at the end of the day, they take all their laptops home. There's no hardware there other than the router and the firewall and the IDS and a couple of the technologies around our network. But there's no data hosted there. So for us, everything we do is in the cloud. We have HubSpots where our leads and stuff is. We work in our application, which is cloud-based in AWS environment. So we have, in that case, we're using a VPN for a different reason. The VPN is to make sure that nobody can sniff packets within my own network. So where we use VPNs, I don't use a VPN all the time at home. I'm not using a VPN now because I've secured my network substantially enough for our security policy that I don't use it. But where I really use VPNs and where we push the use of VPNs is when you're in a coffee shop working, which obviously is not going to be too much of a problem right now either, or an airport or a hotel. Because in those environments, now you're in this network. And sometimes I run scans on networks just for fun to see how big they are and how unsegregated they are. And, you run a network scan in a hotel and you see there's 600, 700 devices all on this network, right? So in that environment, you are now exposed to other people that could be hacking. And that's another form of hacking, where hackers go into very popular environments where people are networking in a shared, open, unprotected network. And then they're able to go in there and do packet sniffing, which for the non-technical folks, it's just basically a way that they can grab pieces of data and then they can use that to basically do man-in-the-middle attacks, do all kinds of different ways to either capture data or then emulate what you're connecting with. So emulate your bank connection or whatnot. So in that environment, so I think, the question becomes, if you secure your home network, a VPN is another layer that you can use. I use PIA. I believe they have, and when it comes down to looking at, the number of people or units, I would look at if you just Google, because I just off the top of my head, I don't really have a bunch of vendors. I don't know if you have any in mind, Craig, but reputable vendors. I'm not a fan of free. I'm also not a fan of using something like a VPN unless you go through a process of due diligence, look them up thoroughly. Have they had any hacks? What's the community saying about them? Do they have reputable customers? Are they still customers versus just logos? Like a VPN, because you have to think you're when you're using a VPN, when I connect to PIA, now I'm basically putting my trust in that PIA on their side are not doing anything wrongful or malicious or not lacking in security controls in their own end. And it's hard to have 100% confirmation to trust anything or anyone. But I look at it like this. I trust PIA, a reputable company that's used by a lot of people around the world that has a pretty good reputation. I trust that versus the 800 random people I don't know in the hotel. So it's which is more secure? Obviously, that's probably the better suggestion. I'm not a huge fan of the idea of VPN as a free service. I haven't used much of it. The reports that I've heard is slow. So like also back to sort of like being secure is great, but being really slow is not good. So like you're also like security should be a thing that is there to keep you secure while you're working. It should not be an obstacle. Like the minute security controls or practices you're implementing slow you down or make your work significantly less enjoyable or doable or efficient, then the security controls are bad or the tools being used are bad. And there's very likely a better way of doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And just kind of, I'm going to drop some links to some of these ones that we're name dropping here for PIA. I've also am familiar with companies that use NordVPN, which I believe does have a free version. And in general, if you are going to look at free, my experience with free products is the free versions are usually better if they also have a paid version. They have more incentive then to make sure that they're giving you a good experience and providing you with reasons to upgrade. Free that has no paid upgrade is probably not I would avoid it if you can.
And so I just Googled to remind myself, just because I haven't thought about VPNs in a while, but Perimeter 81 is a really good one as well. And I've actually met some people from that company recently. ExpressVPN is another one that gets really great ratings as well. I mean, you know, good ratings, good performance, and you know, and good price too. Obviously, is something to consider.
So just as kind of a short answer, who should be using VPNs for home users then?
People that are on home networks, that are working on home networks that they don't have control of, would certainly be one. So if you're in a case where, like, you know, you're sharing a network with other people, you know, that would be one. If you have really complex activities in your network, so I have a friend who's like super nerdy and he has like jailbroken iPhones and he's got like Frankenstein computers that he's built, that he builds weird servers and like uses old retro games and all kinds of whack things. And he's all kinds of weird IoT devices that are from like brands I've never heard of that he uses for like his garden, his indoor garden and stuff. So if you're into all kinds of, if you got weird stuff like that going on, you know, if you do have a really old router and you don't go through and you're not willing to take on that practice of securing the network, that's another factor. And then, like, obviously, if you're doing things that are very like, if let's say, for example, like you're processing credit card information and like doing stuff that's applicable to like PCI DSS or something like that, then I mean, aside from the fact that PCI DSS would mandate that amongst other things, in that case, if they're that high level of confidentiality and you feel that you should have that extra layer, then you can do that. Like, say, I don't use VPN in my home, but I manage the security in my home. I have a very simplified network environment. We only like all of our systems only download applications from the App Store, trusted, vetted, you know, providers. We have auto update on everything, like all that kind of stuff. And for me, the performance is so critical. And again, like everything I'm accessing is also through other encrypted services. So I'm using HTTPS, accessing all of the different websites and things that I use. So it's really it's a weigh it out thing. Like I say, for us, for Securicy, we allow people to configure their network to the network policy. Very simple, basic thing to do. And then that way everybody has good performance. But like I say, as soon as you go into that network that you're not 100% sure of, or where there's potentially compromising activities or devices, then firing up a VPN is a highly recommended approach for sure.
Gotcha.
Darren, I would also say too, similar would be the use of password management systems also. So those are often, you know, for fee. Sometimes there's free versions of them, but one of the things I struggle with is the gap between recommendations of passwords and passphrases, and the reality of how many different systems people are using today. It's impossible to not have, you know, a system to use, because your next option is either you have to commit, hundreds of unique passphrases and complex passphrases to your head, which is, for 99% of us, that's not possible.
No,
And the
it's
other
not
option
doable.
is you have a Word file that says passwords on it, or an Excel file that has passwords on it, has all your passwords. So neither of those are really good options. But LastPass and Dashlane and others offer, I think, really clean, easy solutions there. Similar to VPN, right? Just another layer of fairly short expense that you can do to protect yourself. And for me, right behind that is, from a safety perspective, is, and this is less of, it's not a system, but this is more of just a best practice with applications, is two-factor authentication, or multi-factor, but generally it's two-factor authentication. If they have it, use it. It's a little more painful now. Right? You have to have your phone with you if you're going to get into an application, but generally it's so quick. It's fairly painless to leverage two-factor authentication, but it's worth it for the one time you get that two-factor authentication request on your phone and you weren't just logging in. So,
Totally.
Right?
Yeah, we have a policy also internally that multi-factor authentication is applied in every service that has it. And if a service doesn't have it, that would have come up in the security team's review of the service. So we would adjudicate whether or not, that might change the way we use it, or it might actually, if they don't have it as a feature, it might actually make it that we don't approve it on the security side for the company. We also go a step further and recommend that you don't use your phone number as the validator, that you use a Google Authenticator, just because there are some tricks hackers can use out there to lift that. I mean, two-factor or multi-factor is not 100% bulletproof, but like we say, like really nothing is 100% bulletproof. I always make the analogy, it's like in your car, right? So like if you are sober and your car's looked after and you're driving the speed limit and you're paying attention and you're not texting, each one of these things are a best practice that's improving the likelihood that you will arrive alive and won't get in a car accident, versus 6 beers, a joint, don't have a license, you're driving twice the speed limit. And like when you're not doing any of these practices, you're kind of that person barreling down the highway with complete disregard, right? So having those pieces in play will reduce the factors for sure. And like password manager, yeah, I could not live without a password manager. I think like probably in work, I've got about 30 different passwords. I don't even, and to be honest, and personally, probably another 30 or 40. And so like, I don't know any of them. I didn't create them. My password manager created them, which is great because it's a big, long thing that I'd never remember. And it's pretty much unhackable. But the good thing is, like, then you only have to really know the password to get into your computer, the password to get into your password manager, and then the password to get into your phone. That's 3 passwords. I can do that. 60, not a chance. So then you end up with these things like using the same password for more than one thing, which is like one of the worst things you can do.
Right.
So we are coming up on time here. It looks like we are at 1:15 right now. So we're going to take just a moment to answer another question or two for those who have to skedaddle because they're at their time. Thank you so much for attending. We're going to stay here and answer just a couple more for those who have questions that we haven't had a chance to get to so far. So for password managers, we've got a question here about password manager applications you recommend, as you mentioned it. We have a couple that we recommended in our Securicy marketplaces that are among our favorites. Darren and Craig, do you want to give a shout out to any password recommendation managers that you're familiar with? I heard 2 already mentioned at least.
Yeah, the one that so LastPass and Dashlane are definitely big contenders. And there's another one. There's a Canadian provider that's actually really good as well, called 1Password. And yeah, so they've had a lot of great traction and work really well. They're also good too because it allows you to share passwords. So like one of the great things, like we use LastPass currently, and one of the things when we implemented our business continuity plan and we realized like, okay, well, what are we going to do if the CTO gets ill or his wife gets ill and he's not available? Like who's going to access certain things. So what we did is we came up with a protocol where he shared some key passwords for key infrastructure with myself and my co-founder via LastPass. Again, we don't know the password, but we have access to that in a LastPass vault. And if something happens to him, then there's another individual in the organization that we can then authorize to proceed to access the database. They've been trained and whatnot. So, it gives you that ability. Like generally you don't share passwords, but in certain cases you share passwords. Like if there's a single WPA2 password to access your network, then you would share that with people that are accessing that network at work, for example, right? Or sometimes there are things like that become a shared password. So it gives you a really safe way to share passwords. And a lot of them have vaults as well, where you can actually share encrypted other pieces of information that might be critical to your business, like a safe password. If there's a physical safe that includes, a mandatory backup to a database or something in your building, then and you need somebody else to have access to it, then the password manager can give you a really great way to share that in a safe, secure, manageable way, and you can revoke that access to people at any time as well.
Yeah. All right, I've got another question here on really around communication. And Craig and Darren, I know both of you have some thoughts on this one. The question is around, how do you communicate out to the workforce who aren't as familiar with router setup, and communicate these best practices and tools, and does it involve more training to help them get a handle on setting up their home network, being fully remote staff, and rolling out these requirements to update your remote staff and check their home networks and things? So it's on the, how do you go about this communication and this training process for people who are suddenly remote?
That's a great question. And I've seen a lot of cases where people, depending on the level of sophistication and technical capacity of the staff, like for us, it's pretty easy. We have a very technically inclined team, but there's certainly companies out there that don't have that. And as much as I say, hey, it's not that hard to go into your router and access the administrative credentials and find the router IP address and go in and activate these things. If you have a hard time, logging into Facebook, for people that really struggle and aren't very aware, then it's obviously going to be a bigger feat than it is for somebody who's already used to using like common modern applications and generated user interfaces, right? So, I've seen cases where companies have realized that, hey, we can't expect people to go through and implement a home security program and update firmwares and manage and administrate all the devices on their network, or manage, or their kids understand the technology better than them. The kids are just going to go in and undo stuff or change stuff, or in those cases, I think that's when sometimes the VPN conversation comes up again. And then when you have to look at it and assess your team, and like not every department's equal as well. So there might be some departments that have access to more critical information than others. So you might be more concerned about the security of your development team than you would be maybe of your sales team, for an example. And then I think you can assess. You can also have different protocols for different departments too. And like I say, if you have people that you're concerned, you think it's too complicated, then that might be where the easiest way to do it is just go in there and go on those VPN sites and buy the 50 licenses or however many staff, or, and implement that. Or if you do a tally and figure, hey, we've got 15 people that we just can't ask them to do this. It's not reasonable. Let's put them on VPN. These other, 10 people here, where we want their internet to be fast and nothing else in that chain that can slow it down, like the people doing sales pitches. Let's walk them through. And that's another thing, like you can actually walk people through things. So you could walk people through the process. Obviously at 50 employees, that's really challenging. So yeah, I think you really need to look at your own culture and how confidential and how secret is the data, and how do you assess that in terms of your assessment of risk. and make the decision. But a VPN, again, that is the tool that generally I pull up. Like, in our policy, it's like, if you don't want to do this to your network, because technically, like, who am I to tell you how to set up your own home network? So if you don't want to do this in your home network, then you have to do this VPN. If you can't do either, well, then I have to let you go, because as a company, I have requirements to my customers and I need to implement a certain level of security. So the VPN can be sort of that catch-all of, basically, then you're just treating the home network the same way as you treat the coffee shop, the hotel, the airport, and then they just turn their VPN on. Do you have anything that you would add to that, or any context around that, Craig?
No, I think that's
missed?
great. I do think that's great. I think for people working from home, you're going to have all different levels of skill, and some you may be able to walk through. So, Darren, you had said, hey, maybe we'll do a webinar on configuring a home router, right? And I think that would be really helpful for people that have some base level of understanding. But if you're coming from no level of understanding, that may not even be good enough. And so therefore, it may just have to be a VPN that solves a security problem for you. So I think that's a really good assessment, and because you may actually not be able to, in this distributed environment, get everybody up to secure standards at the router level, because they just may not be able to do it themselves.
Yeah, and I think there's some things that you can definitely do around this to really make it feel like a company-wide initiative. I used to work in the financial industry, and they would roll out like a big communication saying, hey, we're going to do this thing, warning people in advance that we're going to be launching this thing. It's coming down. People kind of feel to know that this new training is coming. They'd say, we're going to do this training. There's videos and tests and things that you go through for people who are not comfortable with the subject after having watched a prepared video or gone through the test or maybe the phishing simulation. Then you have the live webinar that you can do Q&As, and people can really come and say, hey, I didn't understand this. And that can really help if you're providing that way to really catch questions, because you know that people are going to have them.
Yeah.
Wonderful. All right. Do we have any other questions or wrapping up comments, Darren and Craig?
I'll start, Darren. Maybe you can close it. Yeah, I guess my message would be, we didn't hit on this entirely, but as I mentioned, cyber criminals are effective marketers, and they also play on psychology. And psychology is both, is really kind of the inner workings of your brain that trusts things, maybe for the wrong reason. So we didn't talk about it. We didn't show this, some of the visual spoofs, but it is so incredibly easy to spoof a logo or a landing page. I mean, if you've ever logged into Microsoft Service, it's just like you log into a beautiful mountainscape, right? It's visual and it's very nice. It's also incredibly simple to spoof. So I think the ability to separate the visual and the logo from trust in your brain is really important, and that will lead you back to actually interrogating the email the way that it's supposed to be interrogated, which is sender name and hovering over URLs and things like that. So that would be my closing cautionary statement. And in general, I think the questions were great today, and Darren brought up some really fantastic suggestions for home. But you can reach out to me at any time, and I think there's a lot of great information out on the web as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I would echo that same sentiment. Obviously, what I always say is you have to, like, the message that I put out to my team may not be the right message to your team. And so you really do have to look at your team. Like, we're a security company. We talk about information security all the time. We use complicated tools. So it's a different question for me to say, hey, here are the 10 steps to secure your router, than it would be to somebody who's really doesn't use computers to that level. So that's an example of really assessing the environment. And I think when you put things in the context of like, hey, here's something you're going to do that's going to help you, not just the company. I think that kind of helps. I know in all the times I've done presentations and I've talked about, let's start talking about like, here are some really bad hacks that have happened, but I would always try to make sure that at least half of them were hacks that happened to people, not hacks that happened to companies, just to put it in perspective that like these same practices that would help protect your company from an information security perspective are also the same ones that help you. So, you know, any little bit of any gain that you can do in terms of improving people's awareness, improving what they do, like even if they can't do all the things on the network, even the fact that they looked at their router and realized, hey, this is the router that Uncle Joe set up 10 years ago. Like maybe it's a good idea for them to make it, you know, to consider improving on that and buying something more secure. Like more modern equipment tends to have, reputable modern equipment tends to have more security by default than older devices. So like some routers nowadays have update firmware as a default, like it's auto update and things like that. And so newer tech is generally, if it's from a reputable vendor, a better option. But like I say, if you look at that and say, okay, I've got 50 people in this, I don't really see it reasonable for me to give them, you know, get them all to do that, then you can push the VPN model around that as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. That wraps up all of the questions. I hope that everyone got the answers that you came for today. We'll have a recording of this that is going to be available on demand. So if anybody wants to go back and take a look at some of the things that we dropped into the chat or that we mentioned that you didn't quite catch along the way, you'll be able to go back and reference this as well. Thanks, everyone, for coming today.
Thanks, everybody. Take
Thank
care.
you.
Stay safe out there.